Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the BCC Guy. Over the last few months, I've been doing a lot of track work here on the Piedmont Southern, particularly in the staging yard and also on the Helix project. And at various times, I've mentioned little tips and tricks quickly and not really covered them in depth. So what I want to do in this video is share with you some of those tips and tricks and go into them in a little bit more depth so that you'll be able to use them on your model railroad. So let's go ahead and get started. Hit that little red subscribe button, and when the little bell comes up, click on it and click all. Thanks now. Okay, the first thing I want to take a look at, and this comes out of a comment about the different types of flex track and working with them. So I've got some different types of flex track here on the workbench. So let's go ahead and look down at it, and we'll run over the differences amongst these different types, and I'll give you some tips on using them. So let's go ahead and move the camera down. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take a look at different types of flex track. Now this one right up here is Atlas code 100. This is Pico code 83, and that's the American style track. And this one here is Microengineering code 83. Now here on the Piedmont Southern, I primarily use Microengineering for some various reasons. I've been using it for decades, and I find it a very good piece of track to work with. It has very good scale model ties, as well as the tie plates and the spike heads. So they're almost to the point that I can hardly see them. The Pico isn't that bad either as far as the sizes of the spikes and the tie plates. The ties are just a little bit larger, just almost imperceptible, unless you have two pieces of track next to one another that are different. But if you look at the Atlas code 100, those are much wider ties. And this right here is a Atlas re-railer, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And you can hopefully see here that the ties are much smaller than the older code 100. I really don't know. I haven't bought Atlas in quite a while other than these re-railers, so I can't say for sure how much they've changed as far as the size of the ties and the tie plates and the spikes. But the important thing is right here on the back, and I think this is consistent for Atlas track for years. And that is that the web that runs between the ties is continuous on that section of ties, that tie strip, all the way through here on this side. But if you look on this side, it's every second tie has a split between it. So we've got basically four sections of ties that are cast together and connected on this side, and that's about 9 inches long, since they're 4 per 36 inches. And then on this side, we've got every second tie has a cut or an opening between the ties. And then there's a solid piece cast in here. And I don't know, I'll get that up here and maybe you can see that. There, okay. Now that has implications for how this bends, because if you bend the Atlas flex track, it does bend nicely, it flexes quite well. But the rails on this side that have the almost continuous webbing between the ties, that piece of rail does not move. Whereas on the other side, this piece of rail does move quite readily when you flex it. And you can see that here on the end, because I can push this way back into here. And then when I bend it, you can see this comes out. The other one does not. Consequently, when you bend it one way, you pull this rail back in. If you bend it this way, you extend it out. And as a result, you can end up with losing a couple of inches of your flex track if you bend it one way or the other. So like if I bend it this way, then it pulls that rail back relative to this one, so you'd have to cut it off here. If I push it out this way, you're not going to lose any length in your rail, okay? I hope that's clear. Other than that, it flexes quite nicely, but one thing, appearance-wise, when you bend it this way, because we have the continuous webbing here, this side does, the ties do not move as far as relative to one another. So you can see they will stay the same distance apart, whether they're on the inside or outside of a bend. Whereas these guys here, because they have this split every second tie, if you bend them this way, they become compressed, whereas if you go like this, they become splayed out relative to one another. So it makes a little difference in appearance, but it's not all that significant. Now, as far as the Pico, these are a little bit different from the Atlas. They do have what appears to be a much more continuous connection between the ties. However, they have 4 connected together, and then there's a split. But on this side, at the second set of ties, there's a split here, and it runs for 4. So there are 4 ties on each side connected together, but they kind of alternate and they're offset. So there's a split here, a split here, split here, and a split here. And that affects how this behaves, because you can flex this either way quite nicely, and it kind of keeps the shape much better. Unlike the Atlas, you don't get the compression that you get on the inside of the bend. The other thing is, both rails here, if you look closely as I bend this, you can see that both rails do move. That means that it's easy to adjust the rail length on both sides, no matter which way you're flexing it. It's going to be a symmetrical adjustment as far as the length of the rails goes at the ends, and also as far as the geometry of the ties when they're put into a bend, because they just are split on every second one here on opposite sides. From an appearance standpoint, these are probably better than an Atlas that has that almost continuous strip on one side here. Okay, what about the microengineering, my preferred piece of flex track? Well, this one, you can see that there's a split between the ties every other one. So there's a split here, split here, split here, split here, etc. And on the other side, it alternates with that. So there's one here, 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 etc. So as a result, when you bend these, the geometry stays fairly similar and symmetrical on both sides. Very similar in that respect to the way that the Pico works, whereas it doesn't look like the Atlas where it's compressing. The other thing about the microengineering flex track is the rails are set into the ties much, much tighter. Consequently, when I put this into a curve, if I bend it to a curve, it's going to hold that curve. It's going to hold it without any problem until I straighten it back out again. And it is fairly easy to straighten out a piece of their flex track once you bend it. You can put it down on a flat surface and just push down on the sides, and that will get it back into a fairly straight geometry right away. I generally prefer these because of that fact that I can put it into a bend and it retains that shape without any problems until I decide to straighten it out. It is a little inconvenient that you cannot easily move the ties. You can do that if you work with them a little bit more, but I don't see that as that much of a hindrance because it is fairly easy to straighten them back out and work with them. Okay, so that's looking at flex track. The other thing, I briefly showed you this re-railer. Now, these re-railers are great to have around. They don't look very prototypical as far as that goes, but there are places where these things come in handy a lot. They work very well in yards because you can set a car on the track, run it through this re-railer, and it's going to be re-railed without any problem, no fiddling and messing with it. I also put these at the beginning of staging yards so that cars going in or coming out of a staging yard are going to be on the rail and are not going to derail once you get in there. The same thing, going into a helix and coming out of a helix, so that any cars that might have one wheel off or something like that are going to be re-railed before they get into the helix and start up or down, because you don't want a full derailment inside of a helix. And it's very likely that that can occur if you've got a wheel off. So these are great for that purpose. I also put them on the approaches to bridges so that you don't have any derailments and mishaps on bridges. So I strongly recommend taking a look at these. These come in, this is code 83 here. This is a pack of code 100 ones. You get, I believe, yeah, there's 3 of these in a pack from Atlas, and they come with a couple of some rail joiners as well for them. So you can get those, and they're easy to install. They don't look very prototypical, but it's easy to disguise them at a road crossing or something of that nature. And in a yard, you're not going to notice them because you got a bunch of cars hiding them. And of course, in my helix and staging yard, they're out of sight and out of mind, but they do work great. You can make your own. You can just cut some styrene and glue it to the top of your rails to do the same job. And sometime in the future, when I get time, I'll do a video on how to do those. Back when I was installing FlexTrack on the helix, I showed you how I use a screw and a washer to hold down the track. Well, one way to get a pilot hole started very quickly without having to do a bunch of drilling is to just take an awl like this one here. It's got a very sharp point on it, and you can just press down with it, and that will create a really nice, quick and easy pilot hole to start a screw in. So anywhere where you're going to be doing that, and you're going to be putting a screw in like this into wood, you can just use your awl and create a little pilot hole very quickly. And I used this on almost all of the helix. I did a couple at the beginning using my drill and a drill bit, but very quickly I said, wait a minute, I've got a couple of awls, let's try those. So this one, it turned out, works perfectly for that. Now, over the last couple of years, and particularly in the video on the helix, people made the comment that I was misusing my rail cutters to cut the rails vertically, like that, as opposed to cutting them this way, which is the way that Xuron recommends. Now, I also have this pair of rail cutters. These are made for making these vertical cuts, like so. Now, I have tried these both ways. I have tried each one vertically and each one horizontally on my code 83 rail, and I have generally found that I get a better burr-free cut using these vertically and horizontally than I do using these the way they're supposed to be. Consequently, I'm now saving these for cutting my hard steel piano wire, and I'm going to use these both ways for cutting my rails. So give that a try, a test on some of your track, and see how yours comes out, because I've generally found that I get a good clean cut vertically and horizontally using this guy as opposed to using this guy for cutting my rails. Now, when I was talking about installing rail joiners and creating bumps on track in the helix video, I mentioned that that one way to prevent that is to undercut your rails when you're installing rail joiners. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you take a number 17 X-Acto knife blade, so it's a chisel-shaped blade, get a really sharp one, and take and push it underneath of the rails, just like this, and cut off the ties and the tie plates, and undercut so that you've got a little bit of a depression underneath of that rail. And what that does is when you slide the rail joiner on here, that means that there is room underneath of that rail for the rail joiner itself. So it will not push that rail upwards. The other option is to take your rail cutters or something else and just cut the web between these ties underneath there and slide it off. And then afterwards you can carve the little spike heads and the tie plates off of here so that you're basically creating a little divot there. And then after you've got your rail joiners installed, you can go ahead and slide those ties back in here like so and tack them in place with a little bit of super glue. And apply your ballast, and nobody will know that they were ever removed. Now, in the video on the Helix, I talked about high spots that can be created when you install rail joiners underneath of your rails. And one way, as I suggested, that you can fix that is to heat these and push them back into place. So let me show you how I went about doing that in a little bit more detail. Now, in the video, I showed you to just heat the top of the rail to the point that you've softened the ties and you have melted your solder a little bit. And then you can just take that and press it down and hold it until your solder cools and your ties cool and conform to the new shape. Now, another thing that I find to be easier to do, though, and gives better results is to heat it like so. And notice I'm using a flat-bladed soldering iron tip here. And just heat that up. And then take a flat metal object such as this old ruler and put it down on here. And that will spread the pressure over a wider area and prevent you from creating a depression. Because if you're using a pair of needle nose pliers and press down too hard, then you can create the opposite effect of a depression. And you don't want to do that. Okay, so that's one way, that's the quickest and easiest way that I have to take care of the humps. What about the problem, though, when you have the rails getting closer together? Well, the obvious quickest way to check that is with your NMRA track gauge, and then you can just run that, and it's got the two little nibs here for track clearances, and it says track right here on the bottom. Don't know if you'll be able to see that, but you can just put that in between the rails, and that gives you the gauge that you want. So what you can do is just heat one side, again, enough to soften the ties, like this, and then put your gauge in here, like so, and hold that until it cools. And that way you'll get it back to perfect gauge. There you go. So that's all there is to that. And then check it afterwards again to make sure that you haven't gotten any solder moved up on top. So that's how you fix bumps at rail joiners and tight spots at rail joiners. Now, of course, you could have the opposite problem where you actually spread your rails apart. And again, check to make sure with your track gauge and see if it's an issue. It's not likely to be. It's more often that you compress them than you push them apart. But what you can do is go ahead, heat them up, and use your needle nose pliers to pull them together and hold them that way while they cool. So, and then of course, check it afterwards and make sure that you've got a good spacing there. So that's a good space. Now, another thing that somebody asked me in a comment to address was the problem that you can have where cars, when they're going around a curve or in a helix or anything like that, they have a tendency to heel over and bend towards the inside of the curve. Now, part of that can be solved by simply making sure that your trucks are properly adjusted, because you don't want a lot of wiggle room. What Jim Hediger used to do, and showed in a couple of articles in Model Railroader, was tighten up one of your trucks to where it just barely moves. You don't want it so tight that it doesn't move at all. And then leave the other one so it flexes quite freely. And that will help to keep it from wobbling as it goes down the track or heeling over as it's going into a curve. Now, the other problem that can creep up, and this is really bad in a helix, but it's on any curve, and that's a thing called string lining. And what that means is, if you're a student of physics, then you know that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. And if you've got two cars, or a string of cars, going around a curve, they're going to try to follow the shortest distance between any 2 points on that curve, which means they're going to try to go straight as opposed to holding the rails. and holding that curvature. Now, what holds them onto the rails? Well, for one thing, it's the flanges on the wheels that keeps them from jumping off the track. And the other thing, of course, is gravity. So if you have a bunch of very lightweight cars, then that increases the chance that they're going to be pulled over, and also that they're going to be pulled off the track and derail. And this is something that happens both on model railroads as well as on the prototype. And the way that you avoid this problem is you always put your lightest cars at the rear of the train and your heavier cars at the front of the train. And so if you're pulling a bunch of boxcars or any other weighted cars, and then you've got a bunch of splines or anything, empty hoppers, any other empty flat cars, things of that nature that might easily derail, you put them towards the rear of the train. And that will help you avoid this problem of what's called string lining. And that, again, it's the tendency of cars to want to follow the shortest distance between any 2 points. And the tighter the curvature, the stronger this tendency is, and the more likely it is to happen to you as you're pulling cars through tight curves and up a helix. And it's further accentuated if you're going uphill, because that puts even more pressure on those cars as they're going around the curves. So to avoid string lining, to avoid this tendency to heel over, adjust your trucks, get your heavier cars at the front of the train, your light cars at the rear of the train, and that should help you avoid that problem in the future. Well, that's a wrap for this video. I hope that these tips and tricks come in handy for you on your next model railroad project where you're laying some track. Now, as far as Friday goes, I'm not going to be able to do another video on the helix on Friday. Basically, I've run out of track and I've run out of rail joiners. So I have an order in for both. My dealer tells me that he's expecting the track in Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, so about the time you watch this video. And I've ordered 5 packs of rail joiners from Walthers that should be in this week as well. So hopefully, by the end of the week, I will have everything ready to start work again on the helix and finish laying all the track up through the helix. As far as Friday goes, we're going to take a look at the new Walthers turnouts. I managed to pick up a Walthers turnout, and I'll give you an idea of how those compare to previous ones. I do have some old ones as well as the new version from Walthers, so we'll take a look at that, compare them, and I'll give you an update on what they've added to the new turnouts. So look forward to that on Friday. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you here on Friday with that video from the DCC guy. Bye now.